Welcome to Roanoke Remembered, where each week your host, John Garland, a visionary whose transformative projects have breathed new life into historic spaces, will be uncovering many parts of Roanoke's history, iconic buildings, the resurgence of downtown Roanoke, looking back at Roanoke's history and forward to the Roanoke of tomorrow. So sit back and enjoy episode 3 of Roanoke Remembered.
Okay, welcome again to my podcast about Roanoke Remembered, and this is our third episode, and today we're going to talk about something that's near and dear to my heart, which is growing up on Williamson Road in northwest Roanoke, and hopefully it'll be appropriate for people that aren't old guys like me that just talk about their past. And I've got Sherry here that's going to kind of ask me questions about where I grew up and what it was like and so forth. So I'm going to let her start off with asking me my first question.
Well, John, I know that Williamson Road has been always near and dear to your heart, and it is because you grew up there. But the Williamson Road that I saw when I moved here in the 1980s is apparently nothing like Williamson Road was back in the 50s. So tell me a little bit about what the Williamson Road in 1950s looked like.
Well, of course, when you remember back in the day when you're growing up, it's always better, right?
Right.
And probably always better than anybody else that didn't grow up there would think of it too. So, I've got a certain amount of rose-colored glasses looking back at Williamson Road too. Is you grew up in Fielddale, Virginia, you probably think of that as heaven on earth, and I would go to Fielddale and maybe not think it's quite heavenly as you do. So there's that going on. Plus, as a older guy thinking back and reminiscing about the way it was back in the day, I kind of pictured it as a Ozzie and Harriet neighborhood, and you may have to explain Ozzie and Harriet to people younger than me, because that was a show that was on back in the day in the 50s and the 60s, which of course pictured the perfect family. Everybody had the perfect family back in the day, right?
Oh, yeah.
So we tend to think about things when growing up better than they were, but I feel like I grew up in a pretty good day in the Ozzie and Harriet neighborhood where nothing went wrong, and your biggest problem was, your latest scab from a cut or your latest encounter with the bully in the neighborhood or something like that. Never anything too traumatic. So when I think back in the neighborhood, it's mostly good thoughts. So tell me what you'd like to know.
Tell me, did people, first of all, was it paved back in the day? I mean, what your neighbors like? Were they close together? Were they further apart?
Well, as far as what Williamson Road itself was like physically, I have a picture from my backyard because I lived like 5 houses off of Williamson Road, but it was so uninhabited at the point. I got a picture looking down towards Williamson Road, and basically everything was dirt. Our yard was dirt because it was a new house. And Williamson Road, I never really saw it dirt because I was too young, but my parents say when they moved there, which would have been after the war, it was a dirt road. It was probably paved up to what would have been the former William Fleming High School, which is now Breckenridge. So it was probably paved up to there, which was a couple blocks from my house. So I think what I remember about my neighborhood is how connected it was with the neighbors. It truly was kind of an Ozzie and Harriet neighborhood in that way, and you knew all the neighbors. I mean, I can still go back to Williamson Road where I lived and go house by house and tell you who lived there and who the kids were. And there was lots of kids because I was part of the baby boomer generation. Right. And my parents moved there right after World War II, which is the beginning of the baby boomer generation. So almost every house had a kid in it, and everybody played outside, and it was before air conditioning, so all the doors were open and the windows were open, so you heard everything, and people were in and out of each other's house, and you just don't see that much anymore. So I think that's a positive of neighborhoods back then that you don't see now.
So it's like my hometown, small hometown. You would go out, your neighbor's doors were unlocked, you would go in, and you were out all day until it turned dark, and a lot of times people didn't even lock their door. They left their houses unlocked at night, and certainly didn't lock their car doors. I mean, it was just very safe environment.
Yeah, and again, you think of things back in the day as, maybe better than they really were. And some things like that I think are better than what you experience now in neighborhoods, because my kids grew up in a neighborhood that had far less kids and far less people outside, and everything was closed shut because you had air conditioning. So I think that is distinctly different, and I think we miss a lot of the community piece of growing up not having that. Other things I think aren't so good. I lived in a completely segregated neighborhood, so black population were something I never came across in my day-to-day because they weren't in a neighborhood, and that's certainly not good. I long for the day where neighborhoods are totally integrated, that we still, in Roanoke, we still have a pretty segregated neighborhood. It's getting away from that some, and I'd like to see, getting away from that altogether. So that was not so good. I think back in the day we lived more of a sheltered life. We had more taboos. We had more things that our parents told us we shouldn't do, and I think that's not necessarily good either, because kids tend to pursue the things that they're told not to pursue. So when things are more normal to life, and I'm thinking about drinking beer, I think we drank a lot more beer back in the day because it was taboo, and I think now it's it's generally more accepted, and you have breweries all over the place, and so it's kind of part of daily life, so you don't have kids out there just pursuing alcohol as much like we did back in the day because it was so off limits. So that was different, and that was not so good.
Well, do you remember how old you were when you first entered school in Roanoke, and it was it was integrated, not segregated?
Well, the first time for me would be when I went to William Fleming High School. I started school in 1958, well before integration. I went to Huff Lane Elementary, which was all white school, and I went to Breckenridge for middle school, and that was essentially an all white school. There may have been, I don't recall, any African Americans there in the day. I think there may have been one, but not anybody I came across of on a regular basis. So it wasn't until I went into the 10th grade. High school back in the day started in 10th grade instead of the 9th grade.
So what about, now when kids are in high school, for example, they get a job and they're looking for some sort of part-time employment. How old were you when you got your first job?
Well, I tell my kids I always worked because I always had to have my own money to be able to get anything of my own, because my parents just didn't buy stuff for us. So as early as I could go out and talk to neighbors, I was out going to neighbors selling things. I had a garden starting when I was about 8 years old, so I'd sell vegetables to the neighbors, going door to door, pulling my wagon around selling vegetables.
Now, did you grow the garden at your house?
I did, and I can tell you a little bit more about that because it was from a mentor that lived next door to me that got me into the gardening. I sold Christmas cards door to door. I sold my marble collection door to door. I sold donuts door to door. So anything I could do to make money. I cut grass.
And how old were you when you started this?
Probably about 8.
Okay. You were a young entrepreneur.
Yeah,
right?
Maybe a little older than that, maybe 10 when I started cutting grass, whenever I could start pushing the mower. Okay. So, I'd always walk around the neighborhood and see whose grass I could cut. So I was always doing work in order to have some spending money. And then as early as I could, I started delivering papers. There's actually a bicycle route planned with one of the organizations in the city of Roanoke now called John Garland's Paper Route. So did that for a few years, and then as soon as I was eligible to work for real jobs, which was 15, I went to work at New Yorker Delicatessen, which at that time was the corner of Liberty Road and Williamson Road, and that building's been since torn down, but they built a new building probably in the early 80s, a couple blocks up the street, which is still there and it's still in business. It's not in business for sitting down anymore. It's only to go takeout service. So I worked there. I got fired there. So my first job I was fired at, only job I've ever been fired from.
All right, why were you fired?
Well, I won't go into that right now, but
all right.
I don't think I was fired for anything malicious, but anything I was fired. And then I immediately went from there to Archie's Lobster House, which people, unless you're older, you wouldn't remember Archie's Lobster House, but it was what was considered a fancy restaurant far out Williamson Road near the intersection of Peters Creek. It's since been torn down. There's a motel there now. I was a busboy there. After that, I went to work at McDonald's on Williamson Road. The McDonald's on Williamson Road now is a Japanese restaurant, so it's not there anymore.
So being an entrepreneur at 8, you started. Was this normal in your neighborhood? Did most of the kids have jobs at 8?
Well, I wouldn't say they all had jobs. I think it was more normal back then than it is now. And sometimes I think it was a plague because I like working and I do work and I'm not going to stop working. So, it's just in my nature. Sometimes I think that's not so good, but generally I think it's a positive thing because I enjoy what I do.
It's who you are. It's
Yes.
part of who you are. Now, you must have seen people who were hard workers that you connected with. So obviously you developed some mentors growing up.
Yeah, I think that's a very important thing for any kid growing up is to have an older person they can look up to, a mentor, if you want to call it a mentor. And I was fortunate enough to have several of those in my life growing up that certainly influenced my work ethic and what I ended up doing. I know I had an uncle that was an engineer that my mother looked up to and always talked positive about, so that was an influence on me. And I kind of decided I wanted to be an engineer from the 6th grade on, and I think that was an influence from that uncle that was an engineer that I felt very positive about. But beyond that, I had several older men in the neighborhood that were very positive in my life. One of them was Mr. Epperly. Mr. Epperly lived in the original farmhouse in the neighborhood behind me. And one thing about that area of Williamson Road is it all used to be farms. It was totally farmland. There wasn't anything there, like I said, right after the wars when it started being developed. And Mr. Epperly had one of the farmhouses, and then those farmers began to sell their land because it was lucrative for them to sell to developers to start building these houses that everybody wanted. And they eventually all became neighborhoods. Some of the old farmhouses are still there. Mr. Epperly's house is gone. Royal Weber was another mentor that lived about a block from me. He had Royal Weber Florist. He was also Roanoke City's mayor twice. And I picked up my papers in front of Royal Weber Florist, and I always used to ride through the backyard of Royal Weber when I was going to pick up my papers, and I would often run into him, and we'd chat a little bit. He had a goldfish pond in his backyard that I really liked, and he would talk about his goldfish and talk about being a mayor, and he was just a very good influence. Obviously, he was a hard worker because he was an entrepreneur, had his own florist business, was mayor. So, those kinds of things instilled in me. I've got a fish pond in my backyard now, which I think goes back to the days where I visited his fish pond on almost a daily basis. And then there was an older fellow that moved to the neighborhood across the street from me that built a house. And so I was very interested in construction, so I'd go across the street and watch him build his house on a daily basis. And I think that was some of my early influences on construction. So having these older, wiser people in your life that just are involved in some way influence you and cause you to be who you are later on in life.
Of course, there are certain names that, not growing up in Roanoke, that still ring a bell for me. And of course, the Weber was one, and the florist was one. And every time I drive down, I see part of the Royal Weber Expressway, and I always, that's connected to me. So just recently I found out, actually you shared with me, in regards to where Mr. Weber used to live. And so his house still exists. So what do you see as, what do we need to do to help people today remember people like the Epperleys and the Webers and the Halls?
Well, as you know, I'm excited about the possibilities of maybe being able to obtain the old Royal Weber home because it's now owned by Trinity Lutheran, which is right beside it. They're on Epperly Lane in Williamson Road, and the house is empty and deteriorating. And I'd love to be able to get a hold of that, rehabilitate it, use it for some positive purpose. So we always have the historic preservation piece of it, which. There's been some of that on Williamson Road, but I wouldn't say it's extensive. One of the things that would help Williamson Road is identify the old centers that used to be village centers. One that comes to mind is the intersection of 10th Street and Williamson Road. It used to be a community village that had banks, and it had the school there, and it had a pharmacy, and it had a theater. So it was a hub of the neighborhood. And there's been some rehab done there, but there should be more to come, and bring it back like some of these other community villages have come back, like in Grandin Court and in Wasena. And I'd love to see that sort of thing happen. Williamson Road has transitioned over the years. There's a lot of the same old buildings that were there. I used to kid when I was on city council about the same sidewalks that I rode on as a teenager on my bicycle are the same sidewalks that are there now, meaning it not to be a compliment, meaning that trying to bring attention to, hey, we need to spend some money on Williamson Road because everything is just like it used to be and things wear out after 60 years. So let's give it a little love.
So what would you like to see change other than sidewalks? I mean, things are pretty much the same over the past 20 years, you said?
Well, again, most of the buildings are the buildings that were there. Some have been torn down, some have been rehabbed, but they're mostly pretty well intact. So if you ride down Williamson Road now, although the businesses have changed quite a bit from what they used to be, because now Williamson Road is more it's an ethnic neighborhood where there's people from all over the place that live in those neighborhoods, and they've consequently turned the businesses into businesses that support them. So you see a lot of Hispanic, Latino businesses, a lot of Mideastern businesses, which I see that as all positive, but it's changed in terms of the complexity of the types of businesses and who lives in the neighborhood, etc. But again, there's been little money spent on Williamson Road. You can identify a few places where there's been some drainage projects, and has been a section of Williamson Road that's been redone. And I'm trying to save what I think for ideas for that neighborhood or for Williamson Road for another episode of Roanoke Remembers. I don't want to talk too much about that, so we'll save some of that for later.
Now, what I remember, and I know that you're a car enthusiast, so I remember coming in the early 80s, and the first thing people always told me is that Williamson Road was the place that you cruise. People would go to cruise Williamson Road. When did that start?
Well, I'd say it started, I have an older brother and older sister, and it started in their generation, probably more my brother's. He graduated from William Fleming in '64, so that's kind of the earliest I remembered, and it kind of caught on from there. And probably the peak of it was during the '70s. I graduated from Fleming in '70, so that's kind of what you did on the weekends, was cruise up and down Williamson Road, either in your own car, or you found a buddy that had a car that was worth riding in, and you met up at various places. Most memorably was Lindy's on Williamson Road, which would have been past Hirschberger up there a little further, or Putt Putt that was beside Lindy's, or some of the other drive-ins that were down on Williamson Road. So you kind of turned around maybe a little bit past Liberty Road on Williamson Road to come back, and then you cruised out past or towards Lindy's. So it was that stretch of Williamson Road that every Friday and Saturday night they were completely bogged with cars with teenagers in them.
All right, you said Lindy's, Putt Putt. What were some of the other favorite places on Williamson Road for you?
Well, Lee Theater was a hopping place, and different kind of motion pictures of different kind at different times in its life. When I was a kid, we used to go there on Saturdays. I was a patrol boy at Huff Lane Elementary School, so you take your patrol boy badge there on Saturday morning, you get in for free. One of the benefits of being a patrol boy, and it was always some Western that was playing, so you'd walk down there on a Saturday and walk back. It was probably a 3/4 of a mile from my house. So that's one I remember. The pharmacies, all the pharmacies back in the day always had a diner to it, lunch counter. So and they always served ice cream and milkshakes and malts and that sort of thing. So that was a gathering place. Williamson Road Pharmacy is one I remember. Fleming Pharmacy. Airlie Court, which is no longer really identifiable. Airlie Court was at the intersection of Williamson Road and Hirschberger. So that used to be a village center back in the day when it was less traffic, because Hirschberger was, my parents lived there, was dirt too. When I was there, it was only 2 lanes. Now it was before crossroads. So again, you saw all those farms break up. And you not only had the Epperly farm, you had, what was part of the Preston estate, where Preston Park Elementary School is now. You had Andrew Lewis Farm, which is where it was out on Hirschberger, where Crossroads is now. Huff Farm, which was a big farm that now is Valley View Mall. So I guess that's between cruising and going to the movies and the pharmacies and some of the other drive-ins that were that you drove up to for eating. That coupled with just spending time in a neighborhood with neighborhood kids was where we hung out.
Well, how did you feel when things started to change? Because the Berglund Center, for example, wasn't there on the other side of Williamson Road. I mean, as you go the crossover.
Well, that's another topic for Roanoke Remembered in the future too. Is just the what happened during urban renewal, which urban renewal would have started probably about where the old Sears Town is, which is now Civic Mall, where social services is for the city of Roanoke, and the Civic Center and Gainsboro, the industrial area to across the street from the Civic Center. So that's another episode for Roanoke Remembered in the future, because I think that deserves maybe a couple episodes to talk about that, and have some special guests in here that have remembrance of that, of the way it used to be, to talk about that. So we'll reserve that for a future time too.
Well, there are lots of things that are getting ready to change. And of course, we talked about Williamson Road as a whole and how much it's changed. And the recent thing that I just remember hearing about is that we were just talking about cruise in Williamson Road. The cruise in, is that what it was called? Where the cars come every year and they ride down?
Motor City Madness.
Motor City Madness. Okay, so this is not going to be this year. Is that right?
No, and the reason they're not having it is because they said there was too many people popping wheelies and burning rubber and causing a little bit of trouble. And that really didn't do it for me either, because it really didn't mimic back in the day, because although it had some vintage cars, quite a few vintage cars, there was also a lot of just people going up and down Williamson Road too. I think if they were able to segregate people that were there for the cruise in, for the Star City Motor Madness, and to be able to show off their old cars and segregate that from the people that just wanted to come out to the event, and it wasn't so crowded, maybe that would be a little different. And if people could cause just a little bit less ruckus, that could be different. Of course, back in the day, we never spun our wheels or did anything like that. So
no, you were very calm, and you just probably stayed 35 miles per hour. You didn't go fast.
Of course, my car, you couldn't spin the wheels anyway. So
and what kind of car did you have?
I had an Austin Healey Sprite. You could maybe get a little wheelie out of it in first gear, but that was about it. So we didn't spend too many tires in British sports cars. We saved those for my friends that had muscle cars.
So what happened to your Austin Healey Sprite?
Well, I drove that all the way through college. So I drove it from the day I got my license in 1968 to 1975. And I like to tell my kids about the first day I got my license. I immediately came out and jumped in my car and drove 225 miles and never left the city of Roanoke boundaries. So I was driving all day long. So I was pretty thrilled about being able to drive. was also thrilled about being able to get my Sprite. My parents had bought it for my brother when he went to college. And the deal was when he graduated from college 4 years later, it'd be the same time that I was going to get my license, and he had to give it to me. It makes sense on the transition because he was graduating from college, but he took the 5-year route, so he hadn't graduated from college. So he was very unhappy when he had to give up his car to me, but I was ecstatic.
So he wasn't ready, but you were thrilled.
I was ready. He was not ready.
Okay. Well, so there are a lot of changes that's happened on Williamson Road, and I guess maybe your next episode, you're going to tell a little bit about what some of those upcoming changes might be?
Well, like I say, there haven't been many changes. One of the things that we want to talk about in the next episode we're going to have is, where capital dollars need to be spent on Williamson Road. So that's going to talk about, road diet, which a lot of people have heard, or no road diet, which has been a very controversial thing. We can talk about historic districts that have generally not been placed on Williamson Road, which probably should, so that you can take advantage of historic tax credits. So a number of ideas of, what physically needs to happen to Williamson Road that will support the businesses and the community.
Well, I'm excited to hear about it. I'm learning so much just by finding out about history of Roanoke and what's happened before I got here in the 80s. So thank you. I appreciate you taking time and talking to me today.
And, how much time do we have left?
Well, we have a couple minutes if you'd like to take a
Well, let me talk about schools, because schools are, one of the things I do is turn old schools into apartments. So that's kind of a passion of mine. One of the missed opportunities we had, I feel like we had, is my old Huff Lane Elementary School that was torn down.
Like a restaurant now?
Yeah, it's a Mexican restaurant and a hotel. I would rather see Huff Lane Elementary School with apartments in it, but I wasn't making decisions at that time, and I couldn't influence the decision at that time either. So,
when did this happen? How long ago was it?
I'm guessing now it's probably 15 years ago.
Okay, that sounds about right, I think.
So the only thing that remains there is an old oak tree that I used to eat my lunch underneath of when we were able to go outside at Huff Lane Elementary School to eat our lunch. The tree is there, so that's my memory of the school. So I would love to have seen that there. I'm also disappointed that they're getting ready to tear down Preston Park.
Right.
There was 4 schools built in the early 50s that were based on a prototype. They were all the same. It was Huff Lane, Preston Park, Garden City, and Grandin Court. Mm-hmm. So they're all the same school, all built in the 50s. When Preston Park's gone, there'll be 2 of those left. So hopefully they'll save those 2. We actually had the privilege of doing a renovations design of Preston Park probably 20 years ago when they did the last renovation and expansion to that school. So in my opinion, it's a very functional school, still could be very usable, could have a renovation and an expansion to it and make it very usable, and we'd save money,
right,
and we'd save the history of that school. So I'd love to see that.
And at this point in your life, you've done saved so many schools. This would be something that...
Yeah, I know it can be done, and of course they need the site for the new school, so they wouldn't be converting this to anything else. But given that they need a site, it would be nice if they would keep the school. But that's a decision that's already been made. Fortunately, Breckenridge is there. Although at Breckenridge, which used to be William Fleming High School, they only saved the front banks of classrooms, which is the part of the original school, and they tore the rest of it down, but at least it's still there, and you can still recognize it from back in the day of what it was like. And that would have been the first school, one of the first schools built outside of the downtown proper. Of course, the old high school before William Fleming, well, there was 2 of them. The first one was Roanoke High School, which is, I believe, at the site of where the municipal building is now. And then Jefferson High School was built not long after that. So they were downtown, and also Lee Jr. So when neighborhoods started expanding like they did on Williamson Road, they had to respond by building elementary schools and other schools to accommodate all the kids.
So moving forward, since you've had so much expertise now and you've been able to save so many schools, that's what you'd like to see going forward, right?
Yeah, I'd like to encourage the city not to tear anything else down. I mean, there's always, for instance, when maybe you want to consider that, but generally I think saving our history and our heritage in these old buildings and repurpose them and bring them back to life for another purpose is probably the way to go. So I'd like to make sure that going forward, any building like that becomes available, particularly schools, are repurposed and not torn down.
Well, this is exciting. I look forward to seeing what happens as things move forward. And so, once again, what's your next episode?
Next episode is going to be Williamson Road again, its
Yay.
future, and what we can look forward to, and we can still have an influence on how that happens, because the money is becoming available, so there'll be opportunity to have input.
And don't forget to follow Roanoke Remembered on Facebook and all of your podcast locations, whether it's Spotify, Apple, YouTube. And we look forward to keep continuing to share.
Yep, YouTube particularly, because you can see it and you can hear it.
Absolutely.
The other ones you can only hear it.
Correct. Absolutely. Well, thank you, John.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.